I just want to invite you all to go with me in a journey that probably started a few years ago, even before the pandemic. In this journey, what we're going to see is, first of all, we're going to take a look at the external environment. We're going to be looking at external drivers of change and how this external environment, how these what I call forces of changes are impacting the world of museums. Then we will connect with the pandemic, and then we will see how an international organization, a global organization like ICOM is responding to this environment, to this changing environment, basically through two main components. One, a new museum definition, and a second one, a new strategic plan. So first of all, let's talk about forces of changes. So for this concept, borrow from strategic planning the concept of PESTEL, which is basically how external drivers of change impact internal organizations, right? So we will be looking at 6 factors: environmental, legal, technological, political, economical, and social. But how this is related to museums? How can we translate this to museums? So basically, the political force of change include all the political factors and changes in the political climate of a nation at all levels, from the municipality, from the city, from the region, the state, and of course at the national level. So those forces of change from the political point of view could be from very local to national. Going to economical, of course, we have factors related to changes in the economical landscape, including drastic reduction on museum budget, variation on public-private financial support, philanthropy, and charity contribution, among others. And we all are very familiar with this, right? The social forces of change is probably one of the most pressing, one of the most areas where we at museums, we feel it almost every day. And that the social forces of changes involve, of course, all the changes and everything that is happening in society around us, and how these changes and influence the work of museum, including, for example, changing demographic, including inequalities, immigration, new audiences, social justice, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, among others, right? Then we have technological. And it's basically how museums are impacted in their work by the technological forces of changes. How technology is impacting our work. Are we thinking about technology as a way to provide wider access to our collections? Are we using technology as a way to engage with new audiences? Are we recognizing, for example, the power of younger generation, that they are more technological savvy than previous ones? So how can we measure all this? Then the legal, of course, forces of changes that include changes in legislation, labor, charity contribution, legislation, conflict of interest, among others. And then we have the environmental forces of changes, that has to do with changes, climate change, natural disaster, green technology, pollution, corporate social responsibility, right? So all this started happening. Probably, I will say 10 years ago, we start seeing changes in these different drivers. And then what happened? And then we got the pandemic, and the pandemic made everything even worse, right? So when we think about how the pandemic impact an external environment that was already affecting the work of museums, then this is when we have to stop and rethink what we're doing. First of all, we need to understand which of these forces of changes are impacting our work. Maybe all of them are impacting our work, but not at the same level. Maybe in my city, maybe some museums are more affected by certain forces of change than others. What is important is to have this conversation and to understand how the external environment is impacting our work. That, of course, put on the stage our weak points, but also our strong points. Present opportunities for us, but also present threat, right? Because it's the external environment. So the first key message that I want you to take today is take this to your institutions. This is probably something that we all know, how we are being affected, but it's probably a good idea just to sit down with your colleagues in your museum and understand how the external environment is impacting our work and how can we do better, right? Any questions so far? Okay. So based on that, I have 3 questions for you. How the forces of changes are affecting museums in the Caribbean? Everybody will say, of course, climate, right? The natural disaster, hurricanes, etc. But I'm sure forces of changes, social forces of changes are also impacting museums in the Caribbean, as well as technological forces of changes. So how the forces of change are affecting museums worldwide? Is there anything that we can learn from the Caribbean, or the Caribbean area is more focused on 1 or 2 or 3 of those forces of changes and the impact of the forces of changes when we compare to other museums around the world? How can we create equal situation between other museums in other parts of the world that are being affected by the same forces of changes as our museums? So I really want to take this with you, and most importantly, how museums react. We have 3 options. We can discuss it and do anything, but at least we discuss it. We can discuss it and make decisions and try to see how we can overcome this changing external environment, or we can do nothing. It's your option. But definitely we see in museums around the world, we see these 3 different reactions very well defined. Probably those museums at the national level in countries with more resources, probably they don't have to do anything because they will keep the same resources, they will keep the same level of activities, programming, exhibition, etc. But that's not the case in the Caribbean. So we need to understand from all those drivers of change, first of all, how can we take this conversation to our museum, and then how can we collectively discuss it and get together and see how can we overcome these challenges. So because this started, as I said, again, probably more than 10 years ago, I really wanted to bring examples, probably several years old examples of all these drivers of change. So for example, we saw how the devastating fire destroyed the National Museum in Rio. We see how Art Museum in Puerto Rico faced a very long recovery after the Hurricane Maria. By the way, I see the international committee that I was leading at that time, we have our annual conference planned in Puerto Rico 2 weeks after Maria. So we needed, of course, to cancel, right? So Venice Museum reopened after world flood in 10 years. Top museum directors on the challenges of climate change and mastering. 2018, 5 years ago, right? And we have some more. Met and the Brooklyn Museum will not use Saudi money for programs on the Middle East. Ethical forces of changes and how that is impacting our work. Oxford Museums train refugees as tour guide and community curators. Forces of changes, social, recognizing the important value of the immigrants and recognizing the importance of adding values, even co-creating in our institutions. New urgency museums cultivate curators of colors. Finally, was time. Because we live in a very diverse, in a very embracingly diverse society. Are we responding in museum to that? And then we have museum forced to reassess Saudi Thai journalist fate. So these are just a few examples that we can take. Actually, if you go something that I really like, and I think she's here. Lord Cultural Resources, every month they send the newsletter with the kind of selection of the news around the world. I always read it. I think it's fantastic. So that I was reading, for example, last week about some really big issues and protests from the LGBTQ community in front of a big, I think it was the Tate Gallery in London. So I really recommend you guys to subscribe to that newsletter. Okay. This is probably the most important slide for me, the most important message that I want you to take today. Before the pandemic, this changing environment and everything that was happening around, and then the pandemic, this really difficult process for museums, consolidate or reaffirm 4 key roles that museums all over the world play. First of all, museums are memory holders. Why? Because they preserve for future generations the legacy, the identity, and the heritage. So that's probably one of the key roles that in this changing environment, in a post-pandemic world, museums are called to keep, to maintain, and to make even strong. Museums are hub for civic engagement because they play a crucial role in today's global political climate as a space for inspiring civic engagement. How many museums have you seen now that are hosting this conversation? That are hosting conversation that probably 10 or 15 years ago they will never even open the space for, right? Museums are sanctuaries because they provide spaces for conversation to support democracy, and they act as a cultural catalyst where individual voices are heard and where collective knowledge is built. And finally, museums are mediators and are cultural diplomacy agent. Why? Because they build bridges. They build bridges between cultures. They build bridges between knowledge. And that is definitely one of the key roles. They facilitate international collaboration that foster mutual understanding and cultural exchange. So these 4 roles are definitely the roles that I see more and more museums are called not only to maintain, but also to have a stronger role, to have a stronger participation. So the question for you is, how is your museum acting as a memory holder? How is your museum acting as a sanctuary, as a safe space? How is your museum acting as a hub for civic engagement? And how is your museum mediating? Because cultural mediation is even more important these days, right? Oops, sorry. So going from that external environment, external landscape, then I want to take you to the new museum definition. This is the result of several years of work, of difficult conversations, of difficult moments, that in my personal opinion, I think the whole difficult time that we have in ICOM with the museum definition actually help us to have these difficult conversations and to embrace our organization, our members, in a deeper discussion about the museum definition. So I invite you here to read, and if you can identify some keywords here that are probably more related to the forces of changes and those 4 key roles that we identify in the past. So what do you see here that will allow us to deal with these forces of changes and with the external environment and with these roles? Any volunteer?
Foster diversity and sustainability.
Diversity, sustainability. What else?
Permanent institutions. I'm sorry.
Oh, 5 minutes, really? Okay. Okay, so moving forward, so we have a new museum definition. That's probably the whole idea. And the museum definition reflects and allow us to understand and to connect the external environment with the new path, with how can we move forward from here. So now I just want to present very, very quickly how this museum definition and the new strategic plan are setting the stage to support this process. So this is our commitment as an international organization. This is our vision. By 2028, we want to be a more transparent, agile, and collaborative and democratic organization, supporting our network to meet the demands of the rapidly changing world. So we have 3 areas. We have the first one is ICOM is the global voice for the museum community. And we are talking about global positioning here. We are talking about how can we help the network to have a more global visibility and a global participation. Second, governance, financial principles, communication, and diversity. And the third, sustainable funding, climate change, digital future, leadership, and decolonization. You can check the whole strategic plan on the ICOM website, but I took a couple of those objectives here. I just want to mention in global positioning. Basically, ICOM offers an international perspective from which to communicate the role of museums to the public and to promote a deeper understanding of the contribution to the society. And we talked about this earlier today. Another objective that is very relevant to museums in the Caribbean, climate change. Museums are recognized as trusted sources of knowledge and valuable resources for engaging communities to imagine and to create sustainable future for our planet. Leadership. Effective leadership is a key factor in the health of the organization and the sustainability of the museum sector. A leadership culture which is inspired, innovative, and progressive in the face of change. Decolonization. I can recognize the role of museum has played in the colonization process and actively uphold international instruments, including, you can read it there. By the way, ICOM is holding the first expert seminar in decolonization, and it's going to be hybrid seminar for ICOM members, and the seminar will be is organized by ICOM INREC and the University of Shanghai, March 20 and 21, and I think next week the registration link will be available. Sustainable funding. And this is what I want to end. So basically, museums are active contributors to the social cohesion of communities, the well-being of individuals, and an informed and active citizenry. Adequate level of public funding are necessary for them to sustain and develop this role. And we have been talking about advocacy through all these days, right? So it's already in the strategic plan. So how to speak for museums? First of all, get together. Museums have to get together and discuss these issues. Museum has to get together and discuss how can we make the case in front of the decision makers, and speak for better funding, speak for better support and better resources. Second, check best practices and resources. There are wonderful examples around the world that we can take. And of course, there is no formula because each legal system is different, but definitely there are resources and best practice. Get familiar with and share data reports. Know exactly how your museum is doing. You have to get the data. You have to collect that data and that information. Collect your own data, highlighting your museum contribution generated in GDP, but also support education and school programs, create direct and indirect jobs. Share your story with decision makers and elected officials, and connect your museum work to the national agenda, and this is really important. Two final messages that I want to leave you with. Advocacy is not about asking for money. Advocacy is about providing information and building relationship. And then, based on that, you can identify the right people to talk to. The second message is that advocacy has nothing to do with political parties. This is civic engagement. Museums play a crucial role in the well-being of our communities, and that has nothing to do with politics, has all to do with our own communities. So I thank you for the opportunity. I hope this information is useful. Thank you.
So I actually lost track of time because I was so engaged with what he was saying. Okay, so we have 7 minutes. Yes, 7 minutes for questions. Yes.
Do I need the mic?
Yes, we're streaming.
Yeah. I'm curious about a couple things, but namely the professionalization. We're embarking in a process of interrogation of what professional practice is as part of an African museology project. I'm with the African Art Museum and the Smithsonian in DC. And my contention is that the professionalization of the field has actually contributed to the colonization of the field. And that professionalization and so-called professional standards, particularly around collections management, has been used as probably the single biggest excuse why work has not been returned to its origin communities. And so I'm curious how you manage that, because for me the professionalization is not a given, and particularly with the decolonization, I think that there is a potential to have a very real conflict around what constitutes professional practice and by when. And so I do wonder kind of how you see it, and particularly around decolonization when it comes to collection management, not curatorial and public engagement.
Right.
So that's just one comment or question. And then the other one is when you were talking about the critical roles, which I appreciated very much, I found it was interesting that we didn't really address the issue of museums as employers. Employers. Because I think certainly one of the other changes around the world is one of precarity and work and the gig economy and the lack of employment opportunities for cultural workers. And so much of cultural artists, cultural expression sits in festivals or ephemeral activities or our volunteers, and museums actually as institutions provide employment and the potentiality of benefits,
Correct.
for example, that many other cultural forces don't. And so I do wonder how ICOM is also tackling the issue of fair jobs and reasonable jobs when it comes to cultural work, and museums as a fixed institution, which is very, very rare in the public realm, in, I would say, all over the world, and getting rarer in that area. So I wonder if you could address those two things.
Of course. So,
Harry, in the next 4 minutes.
Heavy.
okay. So first of all, let me go back to the role of ICOM. ICOM, as a global organization, we are here to support the network. We're here to support the global network. If those issues are relevant, ICOM will try to support, like we have this framework during this strategic plan. A specific position or going deeper probably will depend on the specific discussions, probably organized by committees or probably organized by a specific expert, like, for example, training. My personal opinion, for example, is that, so related to decolonization, we have a wonderful framework here that will allow conversation like exactly what you're asking, because I think that question is really important in terms of professionalization. How are we seeing this? What we see for ICOM is we recognize the importance of the discussion and we want to facilitate the discussion. But as a global organization, it's not our role to have a specific, let's say, position. We leave it to our network of experts that will help us to discuss the issues and will help us to come forward with recommendations probably. And then the executive board or the ICOM leadership will definitely consider that in terms of future programs, in terms of guidelines, in terms of any other future project. But I just want to say that the richness, the unique value of ICOM is the only organization related to museums that is present in 123 countries. We are a global network of professionals, and that is our biggest asset that allow us to connect easily crucial issues, relevant issues, with relevant experts and people in need of assistance. Museums in need of assistance, and that's the role. That's the role of the Advisory Council that I lead, to bring all these questions, to bring all these issues to the attention of our platform, and see how can we help and how can we support moving forward with this. I hope that's answered.
All right, Tasha, then.
Thank you for your presentation. I was struggling with the roles that you offered about the museums when you said they are these things. As you're talking about advocacy, data shows that a lot of communities don't feel that the museums are these things. And so what was coming up for me, they can be these things. So I'm really interested in around the language that ICOM uses as we're trying to build these relationships with community. Because when you said about the how are we sanctuaries? Within my community as an artist and an art administrator, people do not feel that museums are sanctuaries, right? So I think the positionality of the museums can be these things versus being these things should be a consideration when we're talking to the communities and other professionals in the field.
Correct, and answering also your point, keep in mind that these are reflections based on my personal opinion, what I see around the world in our work in museums. Not all the museums are actively engaged in all of those roles, depending on your own community, depending on your own needs, on your own context. Probably you will have a stronger need, to move forward with one of those four roles, but not necessarily all of them will apply to all the museums. Okay? Thank you for that clarification.
This is the last question, so you'd have to tag Antonio after. After the last.
And I'm not going anywhere, so yes.
Well, my question is actually along the lines of the last question. Precisely because I'm not sure if I heard correctly. If this is an aspiration, this is like what we hope to achieve for 2028. But when you say that museums are not political spaces, but we're aspiring to decolonize and we're looking for civic engagement, how does that happen neutrally?
Right.
When you are a museum in a colonized nation that's been that way for 530 years.
Correct.
So like all of a sudden my head goes, wait, what? What did he say? Are you referring to politics in a governmental way or politics as the power to achieve?
I will say more the power to achieve, because basically, depending on the needs, depending on how these forces of changes are impacting your museum, you have to have this conversation in your museum, in your committee, in your national committee, within MAC. So the whole idea about these four roles is going in this journey that started, years before the pandemic, when we saw the impact. Some museums already engaged in doing activities related to those roles, right? When we saw, for example, I always remember an incident outside the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it was like a protest against immigration, and the protest got into the museum, and they started punching each other in the middle of the exhibition spaces. So it's basically, this is just a framework. This is just a framework for your consideration. This is the message that I want to leave you with. So I will be happy if you take these ideas and reflect and see from this idea what worked for you and what definitely will not. And that's absolutely fine. Because the most important that I want you to take is that ICOM has a new museum definition and we have a new strategic plan. So please go to the website and check the strategic plan and see how you can connect your needs, how you can connect your discussion, your dialogue with our new institutional framework. Thank you.